The smell hit first, sweet and cloying, like fruit left to rot in summer heat mixed with something sharper, chemical. Silas Bramwell had smelled death before in desert field hospitals where the sand got into everything, even the wounds. This was different. This was deliberate. The scream tore through Presbyterian Memorial's VYP wing at 11:47 p.m., high and animal, the kind that made seasoned nurses flinch. Silas kept mopping, working the industrial mop in slow figure-eights across marble that cost more than his yearly salary. 6 years of night shifts had taught him the first rule of survival: be invisible. The second rule: stay invisible. But his hands stopped mid-stroke when the gurney burst through the double doors, surrounded by EMTs shouting medical jargon that meant nothing and everything. The man strapped to the rolling bed was massive, shoulders straining against the restraints. A dragon tattoo, no, a wolf, Norse style, coiling up his neck. His face was gray, lips pulled back in a grimace that showed too many teeth. The wound on his forearm looked wrong. Not just infected wrong, but chemically wrong, the kind of wrong that Silas had only seen twice in 30 years of battlefield medicine. Black tissue spread from a gash maybe 4 inches long, the necrosis creeping outward like spilled ink on wet paper. Purple veins crawled beneath the skin, visible tributaries of something that shouldn't exist in a human body. Silas's grandfather would have recognized it immediately. The old man had kept jars of dried roots in his Appalachian cabin, each one labeled in pencil that had faded to ghosts. Wolfsbane, monkshood, aconite, names for the same poison, the kind that killed kings and emperors before modern medicine pretended such things didn't exist anymore. The gurney crashed through the entrance to OR7, Presbyterian's premier surgical suite, the one reserved for donors and politicians and apparently crime lords. Silas watched Dr. Maxwell Hendricks sweep in behind them. White coat pristine, salt and pepper hair perfect even at midnight. The chief of surgery moved like a man who had never doubted himself, never made a mistake he couldn't bury in paperwork. Silas pushed his mop cart closer to the OR entrance, slowly testing the boundaries of invisibility. Through the viewing window, he counted 10 specialists crowding around the table. They were arguing, hands gesturing at monitors that blinked red warnings. The patient, Dante Volkov, according to the chart someone had left on the nurse's station, thrashed against reinforced straps that looked more appropriate for a maximum security prison than a hospital. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked toward midnight. Silas's phone vibrated in his pocket. The fourth call from Presbyterian's billing department in as many days. He didn't need to answer to know what they wanted. $180,000 for Elijah's transplant. His grandson had 10 days, maybe less. The leukemia was eating the boy from the inside out, and the insurance company had sent their final denial letter yesterday. Pre-existing condition, age of enrollment, experimental treatment. The reasons didn't matter. The math did. Silas had $1,247 in his savings account. He'd been a janitor for 6 years, $13.50 an hour, and before that, 30 years in the Army teaching medics how to keep soldiers alive when everything went to hell. His wife Grace had died 4 years ago because Presbyterian's oncology board decided her treatment was too expensive, too risky, too unlikely to succeed. His son Daniel had died 8 years before that, shot 3 times during a domestic disturbance call, bled out before the ambulance arrived because the nearest hospital was 30 minutes away. Elijah was all he had left, 17 years old, captain of his high school debate team, full scholarship to Cornell waiting if he lived long enough to accept it. The boy had his mother's eyes, his father's stubborn jaw, and approximately 240 hours left before his bone marrow completely failed. The OR doors burst open. A nurse stumbled out, hand pressed to her mouth, face greenish under the fluorescent lights. She made it 3 steps before vomiting into the hazardous waste bin. Silas moved his mop bucket closer, giving himself an excuse to be near the entrance. Dr. Hendrick's voice carried through the open door, smooth and controlled. "We need to amputate. It's the only option left." A younger surgeon, Asian woman with glasses, shook her head. "Amputation won't save him. Look at the blood work. The infection, whatever it is, has already gone systemic. Even if we take the arm, sepsis will kill him within hours." Silas's hands tightened on the mop handle. Not infection. Poison. Aconite alkaloid, specifically based on the smell and the progression pattern. His grandfather had shown him the effects once, using a rabbit. The animal had convulsed for 17 minutes before its heart stopped, the same purple veins spreading under white fur. He shouldn't say anything. Shouldn't risk the job, the tiny paycheck that at least kept the lights on in his studio apartment. Shouldn't remind the doctors that the janitor existed, that he had thoughts, opinions, 30 years of experience that somehow counted for nothing, because he wore a blue jumpsuit instead of a white coat. The words came out anyway. "That's not infection." The OR went silent. 10 pairs of eyes turned toward the viewing window, toward the old man in maintenance coveralls holding a mop like a weapon. Dr. Hendrick's expression shifted from confusion to contempt in the space between heartbeats. "Excuse me?" Silas stepped into the doorway, close enough to see the monitors, the failing vitals, the way Dante Volkov's chest heaved with each labored breath. The black tissue had spread another inch in the last 5 minutes, visible even from here. The necrosis pattern, the smell, that's not bacterial or viral, that's aconitine poisoning. Wolfsbane derivative. Every antibiotic you pump into him is feeding it, making it spread faster. Hendricks crossed the room in 3 strides. Up close, Silas could see the exhaustion around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands that spoke of too much coffee. Or maybe something stronger. The doctor's cologne couldn't quite mask the smell of fear sweat. "Security!" 2 guards appeared. Big men in black uniforms who looked like they'd been carved from the same stone as the hospital's foundation. One of them grabbed Silas's arm, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "This janitor is disturbing a critical procedure. Remove him permanently." The crowd had gathered now, nurses and residents drawn by the commotion like moths to flames. Silas saw their faces, the mix of curiosity and secondhand embarrassment, the way they looked through him rather than at him. In 6 years, maybe 3 people had learned his name. To everyone else, he was just the old man who mopped up their messes. The guard yanked him backward. Silas's hip hit the wall, pain flaring up his spine. His small leather pouch fell from his pocket, spilling dried herbs across the pristine floor. Chamomile for inflammation, willow bark for pain, yarrow for bleeding, the remnants of his grandfather's medicine, the knowledge that hospitals had spent a century trying to forget. Someone laughed. A young resident, probably fresh out of med school, probably drowning in student debt, and the certainty that her expensive education made her better than everyone else. "Crazy old man thinks he's a doctor." More laughter. Silas let them drag him into the hallway, let them throw him against the wall hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs. He was 67 years old and invisible, and that meant he could disappear, could fade into the walls and watch, could hear things that people forgot to hide. Like Dr. Hendricks pulling out his phone, walking to the far end of the corridor, voice low but not low enough. "He'll be dead within 90 minutes. The aconite is working exactly as you said. No, they don't suspect anything. They think it's antibiotic-resistant sepsis. Yes, I'm sure. Why are the other 2 million when it's done?" Silas's blood went cold. Not an infection, not an accident. Murder, dressed up in medical terminology and expensive equipment, happening in real time while 10 specialists watched and did nothing because they didn't know what they were looking at. The guard released him with a shove. "You're fired, old man. Collect your shit and get out. If we see you on this floor again, we're calling the cops." Silas stumbled toward the janitor's closet, his real closet, the one on the third floor that nobody else used because the mop sink leaked and the fluorescent light flickered like a dying heart. His hands shook as he gathered his things, the battered lunchbox, the spare uniform, the photograph of Elijah taped to the inside of his locker. The boy was smiling in the picture, taken before the diagnosis, before the world became a countdown clock measuring life in days instead of years. He should leave, should walk out the employee entrance, take the subway back to the Bronx, try to sleep away the last few hours before Elijah's next round of chemotherapy that wasn't working, that was just buying time nobody could afford. But Dante Volkov was dying from aconitine poisoning, and Dr. Hendricks was being paid to watch it happen, and somewhere in the pharmaceutical darkness of his grandfather's teaching was the knowledge that wolfsbane's poison had an antidote, not in any medical textbook, not in any modern pharmacology database, but in the folk medicine that Appalachian healers had passed down for generations. Silas had a cutting of the plant on his apartment balcony, had been growing it for 4 years ever since Grace died, keeping it alive out of spite and memory and the stubborn refusal to let every piece of his grandfather's wisdom disappear into history. The root would be mature enough now, thick enough to grind into paste, potent enough to neutralize the alkaloid killing Dante Volkov cell by cell. He checked his watch, 11:53 p.m. The last subway to the Bronx left in 12 minutes. He could make it to his apartment, harvest the root, prepare it the way his grandfather had taught him. 3 parts root to 1 part activated charcoal ground in a stone mortar because metal changed the chemistry. And be back before Dante's heart gave out. Maybe. The decision crystallized in the space between seconds. Silas grabbed his leather pouch, scooped the spilled herbs back inside, and ran for the stairs. His knees protested, his hips screamed where it had hit the wall, but 30 years of military discipline carried him down 4 flights faster than the elevator could have managed. The subway platform was nearly empty, just a few night shift workers and a homeless man sleeping on a bench. Silas stood by the yellow line, bouncing on his toes, watching the tunnel for the train's headlights. His mind was already at his apartment, already on the balcony where tomato plants and basil hid the wolfsbane among more innocent greenery. The plant was illegal in New York City. Possession carried a fine he couldn't afford, maybe jail time if they decided to make an example. But his grandfather had made him promise, one of those deathbed oaths that carried weight across generations. Don't let the knowledge die with me, boy. The plants remember even when we forget. The train arrived in a rush of stale air and fluorescent light. Silas squeezed through closing doors, stood because sitting felt like surrender, gripped the pole with white-knuckled hands. Through the window, the city blurred past in streaks of neon and shadow. Manhattan gave way to the Bronx, wealth dissolving into survival, glass towers replaced by brick walk-ups. His phone buzzed. Text from Presbyterian Billing, automated and impersonal. Final notice, payment of $180,000 required within 10 days for patient Elijah Bramwell's scheduled transplant, no exceptions. Silas stared at the message until the words stopped making sense. $180,000. He could work every day for the next 30 years and never save that much. Could sell everything he owned and barely make a down payment. The system was designed this way, calibrated to extract maximum profit from maximum desperation, and people like him were just fuel for the machine. Unless he saved Dante Volkov's life. Unless a Russian crime lord with money and power and absolutely no reason to follow hospital billing protocols decided that gratitude was worth more than gold. It was a long shot. A desperate gamble, the kind of decision that got people killed in movies and real life. But Elijah had 10 days and Silas had nothing left to lose except the grandson who made loss worth avoiding. The train stopped at Freeman Street. Silas ran again, ignored the protest in his lungs, the way his vision grayed at the edges. His building was 3 blocks north, A narrow tower squeezed between a bodega and a check-cashing place. The elevator was broken, had been broken for 8 months, so he took the stairs 3 at a time, using the railing to haul himself upward. 4th floor. His apartment was the last door on the left, locks that took too long to open because his hands were shaking. Inside, the space was exactly what $900 a month bought in this neighborhood. 400 square feet, a fold-down bed, a kitchenette with 2 burners. But the balcony was his kingdom, barely wide enough for him to stand with arms outstretched, filled with pots and planters that he tended with the same precision he'd once used to inventory medical supplies. The wolfsbane was in the far corner, hidden behind a cascade of morning glories. Silas knelt beside the ceramic pot, dug his fingers into the soil. The root came up reluctantly, pale and twisted, shaped almost like a tiny human figure with arms and legs. His grandfather would have called it mandrake blessed, would have said a prayer before harvesting. Silas just whispered, "Sorry, old man. Emergency medicine doesn't wait for ritual." He washed the root in the kitchen sink, scrubbing away dirt until the pale flesh showed through. The smell was sharp, medicinal, like wintergreen mixed with something darker, earthier. In the cabinet under the sink, he found the stone mortar his grandfather had given him 40 years ago. Black basalt worn smooth by generations of use. Grinding took precision. Too coarse and the alkaloids wouldn't release. Too fine and the paste would be impossible to apply. Silas worked in circles, feeling the root break down under the pestle, fiber giving way to pulp, giving way to smooth paste. 3 parts root. He added activated charcoal from the emergency kit he kept for Elijah's stomach issues. 1 part worked it in until the mixture turned grayish-green, water next. 2 drops from the bottle he kept in the fridge, spring water because his grandfather had been specific about purity. The paste turned iridescent, catching the kitchen light in ways that made his eyes hurt. Perfect. Silas scraped the mixture into a glass vial, the kind he'd stolen from Presbyterian's sample lab months ago. Maybe 2 tablespoons, enough for 3 applications if he was careful. He wrapped it in a clean cloth, tucked it into his jumpsuit pocket, checked his watch. 12:17 a.m. He'd been gone 30 minutes. Dante Volkov had maybe 60 left, probably less if Hendricks decided to speed things along with the wrong medication. The subway ride back felt 3 times longer than the ride out. Silas stood by the doors, willing the train to move faster, watching station names flash by. The other passengers gave him space, probably reading desperation in his posture, probably assuming he was just another old man losing his mind. They weren't wrong. Presbyterian Memorial rose against the night sky like a monument to money, all glass and steel and architectural statements about healing. Silas approached the employee entrance, then stopped. The guard who'd thrown him out would be watching, would call the cops the second he showed his face. He needed another way in. 6 years of mopping floors had taught him the hospital's skeleton, the parts tourists and patients never saw. Service corridors ran behind the walls, freight elevators that smelled like garbage and antiseptic, ventilation shafts large enough for a man if that man was desperate enough to crawl through dust and darkness. Silas found the access panel near the loading dock, half hidden behind a dumpster. His multi-tool made quick work of the screws, muscle memory from 1,000 field repairs. The shaft beyond was dark and narrow, but just wide enough for his shoulders. He pulled himself up and in, replacing the panel behind him. The metal was cold against his palms and knees as he crawled forward, navigating by memory and the faint sound of air circulation. Left at the first junction, straight through the shaft that ran above the 3rd-floor hallway, up the vertical section that required bracing his back against one wall and his feet against the other, inching upward in darkness. Voices filtered through the metal, muffled but recognizable. Nurses discussing medication schedules, a doctor laughing at something on his phone, someone crying in a waiting room, the kind of broken sobs that spoke of bad news delivered without mercy. Silas kept moving, The shaft grew tighter here, his shoulders scraping against the sides. Dust filled his nose and mouth, made him want to cough, but coughing meant noise and noise meant discovery. He forced himself to breathe slowly through his teeth, counted each inhalation, focused on the crawl. He was directly above the VIP wing now, maybe 20 feet from room 1207 where Dante Volkov was dying by degrees. Through a vent grate, Silas could see into a storage room, empty except for stacks of linens and medical supplies. The vent cover was held by 4 screws, old and loose from years of humidity. Silas worked them free with his multi-tool, caught the cover before it could fall and clatter against the floor below. Then he lowered himself through the opening, hung for a moment from the lip of the shaft, and dropped. The landing was harder than expected. Pain shot through his ankles, his knees, up his spine. He stayed low, listening. Footsteps in the hallway outside, but they passed without stopping. Voices farther away, arguing about something medical and urgent. Silas cracked the storage room door open, peered into the corridor. The VIP wing at night was a different world from daytime chaos. Dimmer lights cast long shadows. Only a skeleton crew remained, nurses moving between rooms like ghosts. And standing outside room 1207 alone was Dr. Maxwell Hendricks. The surgeon was on his phone, turned away from the hallway, voice low but carrying, "Don't care how it looks, the job is done. He'll be dead within the hour and there will be no evidence of anything but natural progression of antibiotic-resistant sepsis." Pause. "I said I don't care. Your concerns are not my problem. My concern is getting the other $2 million. Another pause. Longer. "The antibiotics did exactly what you said. Fed the poison instead of fighting it. Even if another specialist examined him now, they'd just see advanced septic shock. Tragic but not suspicious." Silas's survival instincts screamed at him to hide, to wait until Hendricks left. But something about the doctor's posture, the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept glancing at Dante's door made him edge closer, pressing himself against the wall. "The old janitor?" Hendricks laughed, cold and empty. "He's nothing. Saw nothing useful. If it makes you feel better, I'll have his work visa reviewed. He'll be deported within the week, but he's not a threat. He's barely literate." The words hit like physical blows. Silas pressed his hand over his mouth to keep from making a sound. Not just murder, not just paid assassination, but casual cruelty, dismissing him as less than human, disposable, worth less than the tile he mopped. Yes, I'll call you the moment it's done. Don't make me wait for the transfer this time." Hendricks ended the call, slipped the phone into his white coat. For a long moment he just stood there, staring through the viewing window at Dante's dying form. Then he straightened his shoulders, put on his professional expression, and walked into the room. Silas counted to 30, giving the doctor time to settle, to check vitals, to make his final notes before pronouncing the inevitable. His hand found the vial in his pocket, felt the cloth-wrapped glass, the iridescent paste that was either salvation or suicide. The smart thing would be to go to the police, report what he'd heard, let them handle it. But Silas knew how that story ended. A foreign janitor accusing the city's most respected surgeon of murder for hire. They'd laugh him out of the station before they deported him. And by then, Dante would be dead and Hendricks would be $2 million richer. And Elijah would die in 10 days because the system only worked for people who could afford to make it work. Through the viewing window, Silas watched Hendricks adjust the IV line, check the monitors, say something to the 2 massive bodyguards who stood on either side of the bed. One of them, scarred face built like a walking wall, said something back. Hendricks shook his head, gestured at the monitors showing Dante's declining vitals, shrugged with what looked like genuine regret. The performance was perfect. Silas almost believed it himself. Hendricks left the room, the guards following him out, taking up positions in the hallway. Through the window, Silas could see Dante alone in the bed, chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. The black necrosis had spread further up his arm, visible even from this distance. The purple veins crawled across his collarbone now, reaching for his throat like fingers. Silas pulled out his phone, set a timer for 4 minutes. Long enough for Hendricks to clear the wing, short enough that Dante might still be conscious. Then he took a deep breath, touched the vial in his pocket like a talisman, and stepped out of the storage room. He walked straight toward room 1207 like he belonged there, like he was just a janitor doing his job, invisible as always. The guards saw him coming but didn't react immediately. He was wearing his uniform, had his ID badge clipped to his chest, looked like exactly what he was supposed to be. The scarred one, Tank, according to his name tag, held up a hand. "You. Shift ended 2 hours ago." Silas kept his eyes down, his voice soft, the posture of someone who'd spent 6 years being stepped on. "Need to clean the floor. There's vomit from earlier, biohazard protocol." Tank looked at the other guard. They had a brief conversation in low voices, Russian maybe, or Ukrainian. Then Tank nodded once. "Make it quick. Don't touch anything medical." Silas pushed his cleaning cart into the room, his heart beating so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. The guards stayed outside, visible through the window, but they weren't watching him. They were watching the hallway, watching for threats from outside. They didn't see the threat that was already in the room. Dante's eyes were closed, his face gray and slicked with sweat. Up close, the smell of the wound was overpowering, that sweet rot mixed with the sharper chemical signature of aconitine. The flesh around the initial cut was completely black, weeping clear fluid that smelled like burnt sugar. The purple veins had spread across his shoulder and up his neck, pulsing faintly with his heartbeat. Silas didn't have 4 minutes. He had 2, maybe less. He pulled the vial from his pocket with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, unscrewed the lid. The sharp, clean smell of the paste filled the small space around the bed, cutting through the rot like a blade through silk. Dante's eyes snapped open. For one terrible moment, they just stared at each other. His eyes were black and feverish and completely aware, predatory in a way that made every survival instinct in Silas's body scream run. Even dying, even delirious, Dante Volkov was the most dangerous thing he'd ever been close to. The words came out as barely a whisper, raw and broken. "Who the hell are you?" Silas found his voice steadier than he expected. "Nobody. I'm nobody, but I can save your life." Dante's eyes traveled from Silas's face to the vial to the iridescent paste inside. Something flickered in his expression, understanding maybe, or just the lucidity that sometimes came right before the end. "What is that?" "Real medicine, not what the doctors have been giving you." Silas leaned closer, lowering his voice to barely above a breath. "The poison in your wound, it's not infection, it's called aconitine, wolfsbane derivative. Every antibiotic they've pumped into you has been feeding it, making it stronger. That's why you're dying." Recognition sparked in Dante's eyes. Not shock. Something darker, more resigned, the look of a man who'd suspected betrayal and just had it confirmed. "And you just happen to have the cure in a jar. How convenient." His hand moved slightly under the sheets, and Silas realized he was holding something. A knife, probably, maybe a gun. Even in a hospital bed, even dying, Dante Volkov was armed. "Why should I trust you?" The honest answer came without hesitation. "Because you're dead anyway. In 20 minutes, maybe less, the poison hits your heart and you stop breathing. Dr. Hendricks knows it. Your guards know it. Everyone in this hospital knows it. So what do you have to lose?" Dante's eyes studied Silas's face for what felt like forever, reading truth or lies or maybe just desperation. Then, so quietly, Silas almost didn't hear it. "Do it." Silas moved fast before doubt could freeze his hands. He pulled back the sheet covering Dante's arm, and the sight made his stomach lurch. The wound was a crater of dead flesh, black and glistening, surrounded by skin that looked like it had been painted with purple ink veins. He could see tendons beneath, white and stringy, and when he leaned close, heard a faint hissing sound, the poison eating its way deeper. He scooped a generous amount of paste onto his fingers, the texture somewhere between honey and clay. The iridescent quality was stronger now, catching the fluorescent lights in ways that shouldn't be possible with organic compounds. His grandfather had never explained that part, had just said some plants remembered older laws than chemistry. Silas pressed the paste directly into the wound. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The paste bubbled on contact with the poisoned flesh, releasing white steam that smelled like burning metal and winter mint. Dante's entire body went rigid, his back arching off the bed, and a sound came out of him that wasn't quite a scream, more like something being torn out by force, primal and raw. The door burst open with enough force to crack the frame. Tank had his gun out and it was pointed directly at Silas's head, the barrel looking impossibly large from this angle. The second guard rushed to the bed, grabbed Silas by the shoulders and yanked him backward so hard something popped in his neck. Tank's voice was pure ice, controlled rage wrapped in professional calm. "Get away from him!" The second guard's fingers dug into Silas's collarbone hard enough to bruise bone. "She's killing him! She's putting something in the wound!" Silas tried to speak but couldn't get air past the guard's grip. He could only watch as Dante thrashed in the bed, his eyes rolled back, foam flecking his lips. The monitors were going insane, alarms shrieking, his heart rate spiking to numbers that should have been impossible, 180, 190, 200. Tank took 3 steps forward, gun steady, his scarred face showing nothing but cold calculation. "You killed him." The barrel touched Silas's temple, cold metal against skin. Tank's finger moved to the trigger. Silas had maybe 2 seconds to live, maybe less, and all he could think was that Elijah would die alone in 10 days, that Grace had been right when she'd said his stubborn streak would get him killed eventually. The second guard's voice cut through the chaos, sharp with confusion. "Wait, Tank, wait, look at the monitor." The heart rate was dropping, not crashing, not flatline, dropping steadily like a fever breaking. 200 became 190. 190 became 170. 170 became 150, settling finally at something that almost looked normal. 85 beats per minute, strong and steady. Dante stopped thrashing. His breathing deepened, became less labored, the desperate gasps giving way to something almost peaceful. And the wound was changing. The black necrotic tissue was sloughing away, dissolving under the iridescent paste like ice under hot water. Fresh pink flesh showed underneath, raw but clean, no more of that chemical rot smell. The purple veins on his neck were receding, fading from dark purple to light purple to just the faintest bruising, visible only if you knew to look. Tank lowered his gun slowly, staring at Dante's arm like it was a magic trick he couldn't figure out. His voice came out rough, disbelieving. "What the hell did you do?" The second guard released Silas so suddenly he stumbled. All 3 of them stood there, watching Dante's chest rise and fall in steady rhythm, watching color return to his face, watching the impossible happen in real time. Dante's eyes opened. Not the fevered delirium from before, these were clear, focused, aware. He looked at his arm, at the paste still bubbling gently in the wound, at the clean flesh emerging from beneath decades of medical certainty that said this couldn't happen. Then he looked at Silas, and something like wonder crossed his face, quickly replaced by the harder mask of someone who'd survived by never showing weakness. "Finish it." Silas's hands still shook as he returned to the bedside, but the tremor was exhaustion now, not fear. He applied more paste to the edges of the wound, working it in with his fingers. Each application produced that same violent bubbling reaction, that same smell of burning metal, but each time more black tissue dissolved, more clean flesh emerged. Tank holstered his weapon but stayed close, watching every movement with the intensity of a man who'd made a career out of reading threats. The second guard moved to the corner, giving space but not leaving, his hand still resting on his gun. 5 minutes passed in silence, broken only by the steady beep of monitors and the faint hiss of the paste doing its work. Silas lost himself in the process, muscle memory from 1,000 field dressings taking over. Clean the wound, apply treatment, monitor response, adjust as needed. The same steps whether it was a soldier with shrapnel wounds in a desert tent or a crime lord with assassin's poison in a Manhattan hospital. Finally, he sat back. The wound was still open, still raw, but it was clean. No more black tissue, no more purple veins, just a deep cut that would need stitches and proper bandaging. But that would heal normally now, following the rules of ordinary biology instead of chemical murder. Dante sat up slowly, testing his body like a man expecting betrayal from his own muscles. Color had returned fully to his face now, the fever sweat drying on his skin. He flexed his fingers, rolled his shoulder, let out a long, shuddering breath that sounded like a man surfacing from deep water. His voice was stronger, no longer that raw whisper. "How do you feel?" Silas almost laughed at the absurdity of the question, coming from a man who'd been dead 90 seconds ago. "Like I just committed about 15 felonies. You?" "Like I was dead and came back." Dante swung his legs over the side of the bed, movements careful but controlled. He looked at Tank. "Get Dr. Hendricks, now!" Tank hesitated for just a moment, war playing out behind his eyes. Loyalty to his boss versus the years of training that said never leave the principal unguarded. Then he nodded and left, his footsteps heavy in the corridor. The second guard remained, but he'd moved to the door, giving them the illusion of privacy while maintaining his perimeter. Smart positioning, the kind that came from combat experience. Dante turned his full attention to Silas, and being the focus of that gaze was like standing in a spotlight that saw everything. The exhaustion, the desperation, the 6 years of invisible servitude that had led to this moment. "What's your name?" "Silas Bramwell." "Well, Silas Bramwell." Dante's smile was sharp and dangerous and full of promise. "It seems I owe you my life." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with implications that Silas was too tired to fully parse. He found himself saying, "You don't owe me anything." But his voice shook because that was a lie, because Elijah had 10 days and $180,000 was a number that might as well be infinity. And Dante Volkov was the kind of man who could make numbers bend to his will. "I disagree." Dante was still looking at his arm, at the clean wound where death had been eating him alive minutes before. "But we'll discuss payment later. First, I want to hear what you know about Dr. Hendricks." Silas's stomach dropped. He'd been so focused on the immediate crisis, on the paste and the wound and the gun to his head, that he'd almost forgotten the conspiracy that had started this entire chain of events. "I don't." Dante's voice was still soft, but there was steel underneath it now. The tone of someone who'd built an empire by knowing when people were lying. "Don't lie to me. You didn't risk your life to save a stranger out of pure altruism. You knew something. Tell me." The honest answer came easier than Silas expected, maybe because he was too exhausted for deception. "I heard him on the phone about 40 minutes ago. He was talking to someone, telling them you'd be dead within the hour, that the antibiotics had fed the poison like they'd planned, that he wanted his money." Something dangerous flickered in Dante's eyes, there and gone so fast Silas almost missed it. Not surprise, recognition, the look of a man who'd suspected betrayal and just had it confirmed. "What else?" "He said even if another specialist examined you, they'd just see septic shock from antibiotic-resistant infection. Nothing suspicious, no evidence of poison." Silas swallowed hard, the next part harder to admit because it made his own helplessness so stark. "And he said if it made his contact feel better, he'd have my work visa reviewed, have me deported within the week. Because you saw too much. Because I'm nobody." The words tasted bitter, familiar, shaped by 6 years of being invisible. Barely literate, according to him. Dante was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he reached for the call button beside his bed, not the white one that summoned nurses, but a different one, black and unmarked. Within seconds, 2 more guards entered the room, moving with the kind of efficiency that suggested they'd been waiting just outside. Dante's instructions came in rapid Russian, his voice carrying command weight that transcended language barriers. The guards nodded and left, their footsteps receding down the hallway. Tank returned moments later and his expression was grim. Dr. Hendricks is gone. Security says he left through the garage 10 minutes ago. We've got people tracking his car, but he ran. Dante's voice was ice, each word precise and deadly. He knew the timing, knew I'd be dead by now, knew the chaos that would follow. He ran the moment he thought it was safe. We'll find him. Tank's promise carried the weight of absolute certainty, the kind that came from years of making people disappear. I know you will. Dante shifted in the bed, testing his strength. The movement was careful, controlled, but Silas could see how much effort it took. He was alive, but he wasn't healthy. Not yet. But right now, I want to know who else is involved. Someone in this hospital helped arrange this. Someone gave him access, helped him disguise the poison as infection, made sure the antibiotics kept flowing. He looked at Silas, really looked at him, seeing past the janitor's uniform to the man underneath. You work here. You see things other people miss. Who else was involved? Silas thought back over the past week, over the parade of specialists who'd examined Dante's wound. Most of them had seemed genuinely baffled by the case, frustrated by their inability to help, but there had been one person who'd seemed almost satisfied by Dante's decline, who'd nodded like it was expected when Dr. Hendricks announced that amputation was the only option. The director of hospital operations. The name came reluctantly because naming names felt like crossing a line he couldn't uncross. Thomas Aldridge. He was here yesterday when Dr. Hendricks said amputation was necessary. Most of the staff looked upset, but Aldridge just nodded like it was what he'd been waiting to hear. And? He's the one who approved keeping your room completely isolated. No second opinions from outside specialists, no transfers to other facilities. Complete lockdown on your case, citing security concerns. Dante absorbed this, his face showing nothing. But Silas saw Tank's expression harden, saw the way his hand moved toward his phone. Whatever was about to happen to Thomas Aldridge, it wouldn't be pleasant. Bring me Aldridge. Dante's voice was casual, conversational, which somehow made it more terrifying. Not here. Somewhere private. I want to have a conversation with him before the police get involved. Tank's smile was not pleasant. With pleasure. As he left, Dante settled back against his pillows, exhausted but alert. The heart monitor showed his vitals returning to something approaching normal. Heart rate steady at 78, blood pressure stabilizing, oxygen saturation climbing toward 95%. The transformation was remarkable. 20 minutes ago, he'd been dying. Now he looked like a man recovering from surgery, weak but viable. Silas heard himself say, "You should rest. Your body's been through trauma. The antidote stopped the poison, but you'll need time to heal." "I've rested enough." Dante studied him with those dark, predatory eyes that seemed to see through skin and bone to the desperation underneath. "How long have you worked here? 6 years? And before that?" The question was casual, but Silas recognized an interrogation when he heard one. Still, there was no point in lying, not now, not after everything. 30 years Army, combat medic, Gulf War, peacekeeping missions, places that don't show up on maps, taught field medicine to soldiers who needed to keep people alive when everything went to hell. Why did you leave? Didn't leave. Retired. Mandatory age out at 63. The bitterness crept into his voice without permission. Came back to New York, tried to find work. Turns out military medicine doesn't translate well to civilian hospitals. No degree, No credentials they recognized, just 30 years of keeping people breathing under fire. So you became a janitor. Needed the paycheck. My wife Grace had cancer. Treatment was expensive, experimental, not covered by insurance. I took what I could get. Silas looked down at his hands, weathered and scarred, the hands that had saved Dante but couldn't save Grace. She died 4 years ago. This hospital's oncology board decided her treatment was too expensive, too risky, too unlikely to succeed. Understanding flickered across Dante's face, quick and sharp. And that's why you're here, why you stayed. Partly. The other part is my grandson Elijah, 17, leukemia, needs a bone marrow transplant that costs $180,000. Insurance denied the claim. Hospital billing gave me 10 days to come up with the money or... Silas couldn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Dante's expression said he understood perfectly, understood the arithmetic of desperation, the way the system crushed people who couldn't afford to make it bend. You saved my life, hoping I'd save his. It wasn't a question, but Silas answered anyway. I saved your life because my grandfather taught me you don't let people die when you know how to help them. The money, that was just hope. Stupid, desperate hope. Dante was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant, calculating. Then, your grandson will have his transplant. I'll call the hospital board myself, tonight. They'll approve the procedure, cover the full cost, and they'll do it with gratitude. Relief hit Silas so hard his knees went weak. He gripped the bed rail to stay upright, his vision blurring at the edges. I can't. You can and you will. I pay my debts, Silas Bramwell, always. Dante's voice softened slightly, almost gentle. But that's not the only debt I owe. You exposed a conspiracy that would have killed me. You risked your job, your safety, probably your life. That deserves more than just covering medical bills. He paused, letting the words settle, watching Silas's reaction. You're not going back to mopping floors. The statement hung in the air, heavy with implications. Silas's throat went dry. What do you mean? I mean I'm buying this hospital. Or rather, I'm acquiring controlling interest. My lawyers are already drawing up the paperwork. By morning, Presbyterian Memorial will be a subsidiary of Volkov Enterprises. Dante's smile was sharp, satisfied. Which means I control everything. Staffing, budgets, policies, medical decisions, all of it. Silas stared at him, unable to process the casual way Dante was reshaping reality with a phone call and a bank transfer. You're buying the hospital. 60% of the shares, yes. Enough to make the changes I want. And the first change I want is you. Me? Director of Integrative Medicine. New position, new department. Your job will be to work with our doctors, bring traditional healing knowledge into modern practice, save lives the way you saved mine. Dante leaned forward, his intensity focused like a laser. Full salary, full benefits, and enough security that nobody will dare touch you. The offer was too much, too fast, too impossible to be real. Silas heard himself say, I can't. I'm not qualified. I don't have a degree. You're more qualified than half the doctors in this building. You just proved that. Dante's voice took on an edge, harder now. I'm not asking you to run the hospital. I'm asking you to do what you do best. See what others miss, heal what others can't, and teach these arrogant doctors that their fancy degrees don't mean they know everything. But honorary doctorate from Columbia Medical School. My foundation has been a major donor for years. They'll process the paperwork within the week. Dante waved away Silas's protest like it was a minor detail. Or if you prefer, we'll fund your return to medical school, full tuition, hold your position until you graduate with proper credentials. Your choice. It was too much. The hospital purchase, the position, the doctorate, the casual rewriting of institutional barriers that had kept Silas invisible for 6 years. His mind spun, trying to find the catch, the trap, the price that hadn't been named yet. Why? The question came out raw, desperate. Why do all this? You could just pay me and send me away." Dante was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the New York skyline, the city of money and power and people who got crushed between the two. "Because I was dead, truly dead. The best doctors in New York had given up on me. My own people were preparing for war, and then a man I'd never met, a man who had every reason to let me die, risked everything to save me." He turned back to Silas, and for the first time the predator's mask slipped enough to show something almost human underneath. "You didn't do it for money or power or favor. You did it because it was right, because you saw someone suffering and you knew how to help." His smile was small and genuine. "People like that are rare in my world, Silas Bramwell. I'd be a fool to let you disappear back into invisibility." The words settled into Silas's chest, warm and dangerous, the kind of recognition he hadn't felt since Grace died, since his son was killed, since the army decided he was too old to be useful. For 6 years he'd been invisible, less than furniture, a ghost in a blue jumpsuit. And now this man, this dangerous man who built empires on violence and loyalty, was offering to make him seen. "People like me usually don't last long in your world." "No." Dante's agreement was matter-of-fact, honest in a way that was almost refreshing. "They don't, which is why you'll have protection. Tank and his team will make sure nothing happens to you. And anyone who tries to hurt you will learn very quickly why crossing the Volkov syndicate is a fatal mistake." The door opened and medical staff flooded in. Nurses, a resident doctor, a supervisor. They stopped short when they saw Dante sitting up, conscious, alive. The shock on their faces would have been funny if Silas had any energy left for laughter. A young nurse, maybe 25, found her voice first. "Mr. Volkov, you're awake. How do you feel?" "Better than expected." Dante gestured at his arm, at the clean wound where death had been spreading hours before. "Thanks to Dr. Bramwell here." Every eye in the room turned to Silas, the janitor in the faded blue jumpsuit standing by the bed with iridescent paste on his fingers and exhaustion written across his face. He saw confusion, disbelief, the beginning of questions that would take hours to answer. The resident doctor, young man with glasses and the kind of confidence that came from never being wrong, stepped forward. "I'm sorry, but who are you? You're not on staff." Dante's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Dr. Bramwell is now Director of Integrative Medicine. You'll show him the same respect you show any other physician on staff. Understood?" The resident's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. The nurses exchanged glances, confusion giving way to curiosity, to the beginning of gossip that would spread through the hospital by morning. The supervisor, older woman with sharp eyes and a sharper attitude, looked at Silas like she was trying to solve an equation that didn't balance. But they all nodded, because when Dante Volkov spoke, people listened or they disappeared. The next 2 hours were a blur of medical procedures. Doctors examined the wound, took blood samples, ran scans. Silas explained the poison as best he could, described how the antidote worked, warned them about potential secondary effects. They listened with varying degrees of skepticism and wonder, but they listened. The iridescent paste had done what their antibiotics couldn't, and that demanded at least professional curiosity. The wound itself was remarkable. Where there had been black necrotic tissue, there was now clean pink flesh, raw but healing. The doctors cleaned it properly, applied modern bandaging, started Dante on fluids and pain medication. His vitals continued to improve, blood pressure normalizing, temperature dropping to baseline, white blood cell count stabilizing. By 3 in the morning, Dante was arguing with Tank about security protocols, which seemed like a good sign. By 4, he was making phone calls, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone reshaping the world to his preferences. Tank returned with Thomas Aldridge at 4:30. The director of hospital operations was a small man in an expensive suit, his thinning hair carefully combed to hide his bald spot. When he saw Dante alive and alert, all color drained from his face. Dante's voice was conversational, almost friendly, which somehow made it more terrifying. "Mr. Aldridge, I was told you were dying." Aldridge's voice came out barely above a whisper. I was told you were... I don't understand." "I got better. Funny how that works." Dante gestured at the chair beside his bed. "Sit. We need to talk." Aldridge sat like a man going to his execution, hands trembling, sweat beading on his forehead despite the hospital's aggressive air conditioning. Tank positioned himself by the door, blocking the exit, his expression promising violence if Aldridge made any sudden moves. "I want to know who paid Dr. Hendricks to kill me." Dante's tone was patient, reasonable, the voice of someone who had all the time in the world. "And I want to know what your role was in making it happen." I have no idea what—" Tank stepped forward, holding up a smartphone that definitely wasn't his. 14 calls to Dr. Hendricks over the past week, 6 calls to a number registered to Adriano Moretti's organization. You want to explain that? The Moretti name hit the room like a bomb. Even Silas knew that name. One of the major East Coast crime families, Volkov's biggest rivals for control of smuggling routes and protection rackets. If they'd arranged this, it wasn't just murder. It was the opening move in a war. Aldridge's face went from white to gray, the color of someone who'd just realized how badly they'd miscalculated. Please, I can explain." "I'm listening." Dante's voice was still calm, but Silas saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand rested just within reach of the knife he'd undoubtedly hidden somewhere in the bed. They threatened my family." The words came out in a rush, desperate and broken. "My daughter. She's 12. They had photos of her leaving school, of my wife at the market. They said if I didn't help, if I didn't keep the outside specialists away, they'd—" He choked on whatever came next, tears streaming down his face in a display of fear so raw it was almost painful to witness. Dante studied him for a long moment, reading truth or lies, or maybe just the depth of terror that made people do terrible things. "And Dr. Hendricks? They paid him, a lot, enough that he didn't need threats." Aldridge's voice was barely audible now. "He was supposed to let the poison work, make it look natural. By the time anyone suspected foul play, you'd be dead and he'd be in another country. But I'm not dead." Dante's smile was sharp and cold. "Thanks to Dr. Bramwell here, which means Dr. Hendricks's plan failed, which means everyone involved is now exposed." He paused, letting that sink in, "Including you." Aldridge started to shake, full-body tremors that spoke of a man facing consequences he'd never prepared for. "Please, my family had nothing to do with this. It was just me. Just me following orders because they said my daughter—" Dante held up a hand, silencing him. "Tank, verify his story. If his family really was threatened, get them somewhere safe. The Moretti organization likes to tie up loose ends." Tank nodded. "On it." Dante turned back to Aldridge, and something in his expression softened slightly. Not mercy exactly, but understanding. "You're going to give the police everything. Every phone call, every meeting, every piece of evidence that connects Dr. Hendricks and the Moretti family to this. You're going to cooperate fully, and in exchange, I'll make sure your family stays safe. Do you understand?" Aldridge nodded frantically. Yes, anything. I'll give them everything." "Good. Tank will escort you to the precinct. If you try to run, if you try to warn anyone, if you do anything except exactly what I've told you—" Dante's voice went very quiet. "Your daughter won't make it to her 13th birthday." The threat hung in the air, absolute and final. Aldridge nodded again, beyond words now, just a man who'd gambled with forces beyond his control and lost everything. Tank let him out, and the room fell silent except for the steady beep of monitors. Silas stood by the window, watching the city wake up, the sun starting to paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. He'd been awake for 26 hours straight, His body ached, his mind felt like static, and he'd just witnessed a crime lord threaten a man's child while casually buying a hospital. Dante's voice cut through his thoughts. "You're exhausted. Tank will take you to one of our safe houses. It's secure, comfortable, close to the hospital. Sleep, eat, process everything that's happened. Then we'll talk about your future." Silas turned from the window. "I have my own apartment. You had your own apartment. As of now, it's under surveillance by Moretti's people. They know who you are, know where you live, know you're the reason I'm still breathing." Dante's expression was serious, almost gentle. "Until this is resolved, until we've dealt with everyone involved, you're staying somewhere safe, non-negotiable." The word safe felt foreign, disconnected from anything Silas had experienced in the past 6 years. But he was too tired to argue, too wrung out to fight against the tide of Dante's certainty. Tank appeared in the doorway, fresh and alert despite the hour. "Car's ready. I'll get you settled." Silas followed him out into the hallway, past nurses who stared at the janitor walking with Dante Volkov's head of security, past the VIP wing that had been his hunting ground for 6 years, down to the parking garage where a black Mercedes waited with tinted windows and the promise of violence barely concealed. The drive to Tribeca passed in silence. Silas watched the city scroll past, the early morning commuters already filling the streets, the world continuing as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Dante Volkov was alive, Dr. Hendricks was running, and Silas Bramwell, invisible janitor, was apparently now doctor. Silas Bramwell, director of integrative medicine, with enemies who wanted him dead and allies who traded in the same currency. The safe house was a penthouse, all glass and steel and views that cost more per month than Silas made in a year. Tank showed him the security features, cameras, panic buttons, reinforced doors, with the casual efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "Get some rest. I'll have clothes and supplies brought up. If you need anything, there's a phone by the bed, direct line to our security team." Then he was alone. Silas stood in the middle of the penthouse, looking at luxury he couldn't process, exhaustion finally catching up to him. He made it to the bedroom, sat on the edge of a bed that probably cost more than his car, and pulled out his phone. One missed call from Elijah. One text, sent at 2 a.m. "Grandpa, where are you? Nurses said you didn't come by. Are you okay?" Silas's hands shook as he typed back, "I'm fine. Something came up. I'll explain everything soon. How are you feeling?" The response came immediately. "Tired, scared. The doctor said we need to talk about options. I think that means bad news." Not anymore, Silas thought. Not if Dante keeps his word. He sent back, "Hold on, kid. Things are about to get better, I promise." He set the phone down and let himself fall back onto the bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the last 8 hours in his mind. The poison, the paste, the bubbling tissue, Dante's eyes opening. Tank's gun to his temple, the hospital being bought like it was a convenience store, the casual threats and casual promises from a man who reshaped reality through sheer force of will. Silas closed his eyes and let the exhaustion pull him under, falling into sleep with the taste of iridescent paste still on his fingers, and the knowledge that he'd crossed a line tonight that couldn't be uncrossed. He'd saved a life and maybe sold his soul, and only time would tell which transaction mattered more. Silas woke to sunlight cutting through floor-to-ceiling windows, disoriented by the absence of his apartment's familiar water stains and traffic noise. The penthouse bedroom was silent except for the faint hum of climate control, the kind of quiet that only expensive architecture could buy. His phone showed 2:47 p.m. He'd slept 14 hours straight, dreamless and deep, his body finally cashing checks his adrenaline had been writing all night. The shower was marble and chrome, water pressure that felt like a massage, temperature controls more complex than anything he'd operated since retiring from the military. Silas stood under the spray until his muscles stopped aching, until the last traces of iridescent paste washed from under his fingernails, swirling down the drain in colors that shouldn't exist in nature. Clean clothes waited on the bed, expensive casual wear in exactly his size, tags still attached. Someone had measured him with precision, probably while he slept. The thought should have been unsettling, but Silas was too far past normal to register new violations of privacy. His phone rang. Unknown number, but the area code was local. Silas answered. "Hello?" Tank's voice, professional and calm. "You're awake. Good. Mr. Volkov would like to see you. Car's downstairs whenever you're ready." The line went dead before Silas could respond. He finished dressing. Dark jeans, gray Henley, leather jacket that fit like it had been tailored for him, and took the private elevator down to street level. The Mercedes waited at the curb, Tank behind the wheel, wearing sunglasses that hid whatever he was thinking. The drive took 20 minutes through Manhattan traffic, heading north toward the Upper East Side. Tank didn't speak, didn't acknowledge Silas beyond a professional nod when he climbed into the back seat. The silence felt deliberate, loaded with things neither of them were ready to name. They pulled up to a brownstone that looked like old money trying not to be noticed. Understated elegance, wrought iron fence, window boxes with flowers that probably cost more than Silas's monthly rent used to. Tank opened the door, gestured for Silas to follow. Inside, the brownstone was warmer than the penthouse, lived in rather than displayed. Family photos lined the hallway, Dante younger, harder, standing beside an older man who had the same predator's eyes. A woman with silver hair and the kind of beauty that age couldn't touch. More recent photos showed gatherings, celebrations, the complex web of a family that existed outside normal society. Dante was in what looked like a study, sitting in a leather chair with his arm properly bandaged, color fully returned to his face. He wore a black dress shirt and slacks, looking more like a corporate executive than a crime lord who'd been dead yesterday. A woman sat across from him, 70 at least, silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun, eyes that missed nothing. She turned when Silas entered, and her gaze was sharp enough to cut. "So this is the man who saved my son." Her accent was Russian, thick and unapologetic, each word carefully chosen. Dante gestured to an empty chair. "My mother, Galina Volkov. Mama, this is Dr. Silas Bramwell." Galina's expression didn't change. "He doesn't look like a doctor. Neither did the 12 specialists who were ready to let me die." Dante's voice carried fond exasperation, the tone of someone who'd had this argument before. "Dr. Bramwell used medicine they don't teach in medical schools, folk remedies from the Appalachian Mountains, the kind of knowledge your grandmother would have recognized." Something shifted in Galina's eyes, interest replacing skepticism. "My babushka was a healer, in the old country before—" She waved a hand, dismissing decades of history. She knew plants, herbs, things that doctors called superstition, until someone was dying and modern medicine failed. Then they came to her. Silas found his voice. "My grandfather was the same. Lived in the mountains, treated people who couldn't afford hospitals or didn't trust them. He said the plants remember things we've forgotten." Galina nodded slowly, approval replacing suspicion. "Your grandfather was wise. The old ways work because they're true, not because we believe in them." She stood, crossed to a cabinet, pulled out a bottle of vodka that looked older than Silas. "We drink. To your grandfather. To my babushka. To knowledge that survives." The vodka burned going down, smooth and harsh in equal measure. Galina poured 3 glasses without asking, the gesture somewhere between hospitality and test. Silas drank because refusing felt dangerous, because something in Galina's eyes said she was measuring him against standards he didn't fully understand. When the glasses were empty, she set them down with finality. "You have permission to court my son." Dante laughed, the sound genuine and warm. "Mama, it's not like that. I know what it's like. You owe him your life. That creates bond stronger than blood sometimes. She looked at Silas, her expression serious. You will be family now, whether you want to or not. The Volkov family protects its own, but we also test our own. You understand? Silas understood he was in water far deeper than saving a life, that Galina Volkov was offering something that came with invisible price tags and unspoken obligations. I understand. Good. She collected the bottle and glasses, headed for the door. I make dinner. You stay. We talk more about your grandfather's plants. When she was gone, Dante leaned back in his chair, wincing slightly. Congratulations, you passed the first test. My mother doesn't approve of many people. What happens if I'd failed? Tank would have driven you somewhere quiet to discuss your future employment prospects. Dante's smile suggested he was only half joking. But you didn't fail, so we can discuss actual business. He pulled out a folder, slid it across the desk. Inside were documents, contracts, purchase agreements, organizational charts. The letterhead read Presbyterian Memorial Hospital with a new subtitle, a Volkov Medical Enterprise. The acquisition finalized an hour ago, 62% controlling interest. I now own Presbyterian Memorial Hospital, and the board of directors has accepted my recommended restructuring. Silas flipped through the documents, seeing his own name repeated in places that didn't make sense. Director of Integrative Medicine, Department Head, Research Budget Allocation. Effective immediately, your office is being prepared now, 4th floor, corner suite overlooking the park. Dante's voice carried satisfaction, the tone of someone who enjoyed rewriting rules. Your first task is to hire staff. I want at least 3 physicians willing to learn traditional medicine, 2 research assistants and consultants from whatever healing traditions you think are worth preserving. The scope was overwhelming, impossible. I don't have the credentials to... Dante slid another document across the desk. Honorary Doctorate in Integrative Medicine from Columbia Medical School, dated today, signed by the Dean of Medicine with enough flourishes to suggest someone had been paid very well to make this happen very quickly. Now you have credentials. The ceremony is scheduled for next month if you want the full academic experience, but the degree is legally binding as of this morning. Silas stared at his name in embossed gold lettering, feeling like reality had become untethered from anything he recognized as normal. You can't just buy a medical degree. I didn't buy it. I made a very generous donation to Columbia's research fund, and they decided your lifetime of practical experience was worth recognizing. Dante's expression was matter-of-fact. The distinction matters legally even if it feels the same to you. The argument died in Silas's throat because what was the point? Dante Volkov had decided to remake the world, and apparently the world was cooperating. He changed tactics. What about Elijah? You said, your grandson's transplant is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Presbyterian's best transplant surgeon, full team, private recovery suite. Dante's voice softened slightly. I called the hospital board myself this morning. They were very understanding about the importance of prioritizing his case. Relief hit like a physical blow, strong enough that Silas had to grip the desk to stay upright. Tomorrow. Elijah would have his transplant tomorrow, not in some impossible future where $180,000 materialized from nowhere, but tomorrow, real and happening and possible because a crime lord paid his debts. The words came out rough. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. There are complications. Dante's expression darkened. The Moretti family knows I survived. They know you're the reason, and they're not taking it well. He pulled out another folder, this one containing surveillance photos, Silas's apartment building, front entrance, fire escape. Red circles marked specific windows, his window, the balcony where he'd grown the wolfsbane plant. More photos showed men in dark clothes, professional and patient, watching his building like predators studying prey. We evacuated your apartment this morning, removed everything personal, Photos, documents, your grandfather's medical books, the plants from your balcony. Dante tapped one of the photos. The wolfsbane is being cultivated in a secure facility. The other plants are in my mother's greenhouse. She was very impressed by your collection. Silas's hands trembled as he looked through the photos, seeing his life reduced to tactical intelligence. They're going to kill me. They're going to try, which is why you don't go anywhere without Tank or one of his team. No exceptions, no negotiation. Dante's voice carried absolute authority. The Moretti organization is old school. They see you as an insult, a loose end, someone who made them look weak. They'll come for you eventually. Eventually? They're dealing with other problems right now. Thomas Aldridge gave the FBI everything. Phone records, meeting notes, wire transfer receipts. The Moretti family is facing multiple federal investigations, and several of their key people are already in custody. Dante smiled, sharp and satisfied. Dr. Hendricks was picked up in Miami this morning trying to board a plane to Rio. He's being extradited back to New York. The news should have brought satisfaction. Justice served and enemies caught. Instead, Silas felt only exhaustion at the machinery of violence that kept turning, grinding people up regardless of who was right or wrong. And that makes me safe? That makes you safer. Not the same thing. Dante stood, testing his balance, still weak but functional. Which brings me to the other reason I asked you here. I want to show you something. He led Silas through the brownstone, down to a basement that had been converted into something between a gym and a shooting range. Targets lined one wall, workout equipment the other, the smell of gun oil and old sweat permeating everything. 3 men were training. Hand-to-hand combat, fast and brutal, the kind of efficiency that came from real violence rather than martial arts classes. They stopped when Dante entered, nodding respect. Dante gestured to the oldest one, maybe 45, built like a brick wall with scar tissue that told stories. Victor was Spetsnaz. He trains my security team. Victor, this is Dr. Bramwell. I want him combat ready. Victor looked Silas up and down, professional assessment that missed nothing. How old? 67. Military background? 30 years, Army combat medic, served through multiple deployments. Victor's expression shifted slightly, respect replacing skepticism. Good foundation. We work with what you have, build what you need. When do we start? Dante answered before Silas could. Tomorrow, after his grandson's surgery. I want him training 4 days a week, 2 hours per session. Focus on defensive tactics, situational awareness, how to survive when things go wrong. Silas found his voice, confusion overriding exhaustion. I'm 67 years old. I'm not going to become some action hero. No. Dante's agreement was calm, reasonable. But you're going to learn how to stay alive when professionals are trying to kill you. Big difference. The logic was sound even if the situation remained insane. Silas nodded slowly. 4 days a week, after Elijah's recovery is stable. Good. Dante headed back upstairs, moving carefully, still healing. Now let's discuss your new department. I have some ideas about integration. The next 4 hours were a blur of planning sessions. Dante had apparently spent his recovery time thinking about how to remake Presbyterian Memorial's approach to medicine, combining traditional healing with modern technology. He wanted research teams studying folk remedies, clinical trials testing herbal compounds, partnerships with indigenous healers from multiple cultures. The scope was ambitious, bordering on impossible. But Dante spoke with the certainty of someone who'd built an empire through sheer force of will. Silas found himself sketching organizational charts, proposing research directions, naming healers his grandfather had mentioned who might still be alive and willing to share knowledge. Galina called them for dinner at 7. The meal was elaborate. Borscht, pelmeni, black bread that tasted like childhood memories Silas didn't have. She asked questions about Appalachian medicine while they ate, comparing notes with her own grandmother's teachings. finding common threads between mountain folk remedies and old Russian healing traditions. Somewhere between the second course and dessert, Silas realized he was being welcomed into something larger than employment, that the Volkov family operated on different rules than corporate hierarchies or military chains of command. This was older, more fundamental, the kind of loyalty that came from shared danger and mutual debt. His phone rang during coffee. Elijah's number. Silas excused himself, stepped into the hallway. "Hey, kid, how are you feeling?" Elijah's voice was confused, cautious. "Grandpa, what's going on? The hospital called. They said my transplant is scheduled for tomorrow morning. They said everything's approved, everything's covered, and I should be here by 6 a.m. That's right. But we couldn't afford it. They sent the denial letter. You said we'd have to find another way." Silas leaned against the wall, suddenly bone-tired. "We found another way. It's complicated, but it's real. You're getting your transplant tomorrow." Silence on the other end, then. "You didn't do anything illegal, did you?" The question was so earnest, so worried that Silas almost laughed. "Not exactly. I helped someone who needed help, and they're returning the favor." "That doesn't sound like you. You always said to stay invisible, keep your head down, don't make waves." "Yeah, well." Silas looked back into the dining room where Dante and Galena were discussing something in rapid Russian. "Sometimes staying invisible means letting people die. I couldn't do that this time." Elijah was quiet for a moment. "I'm scared, Grandpa." "Me too, kid. But we're going to get through this. You're going to have the surgery, beat the cancer, and go to Cornell like your mom wanted." "What about you? Are you okay? You sound different." Different was an understatement. 48 hours ago, Silas had been a janitor counting pennies and days. Now he was Dr. Bramwell, director of integrative medicine, with enemies who wanted him dead and allies who operated outside the law. Different didn't begin to cover it. "I'm fine, just tired. Get some rest tonight. I'll be there in the morning before they take you to prep." "Okay. And Grandpa? Thank you for everything, for not giving up." The line went dead. Silas stood in the hallway, phone in hand, feeling the weight of what he'd done settling into his bones. Saving Dante hadn't just bought Elijah's transplant. It had bought entry into a world that operated on violence and loyalty in equal measure, where debts were paid in blood or money with no middle ground. Tank appeared at the end of the hallway. "Ready to head back? Mr. Volkov said you need rest before tomorrow." The drive to the penthouse passed in silence. Silas watched the city lights, thinking about Elijah, about Dante, about the strange mathematics that had turned one desperate act into this cascade of consequences. Tank pulled up to the curb, engine idling. "The transplant will go well. Mr. Volkov's doctor is the best in the state. Your grandson is in good hands." It was the most Tank had said directly to Silas since they'd met. The words carried weight beyond simple reassurance. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Just stay alive. Mr. Volkov doesn't need another funeral this year." The penthouse felt less foreign now, more like a temporary refuge than a gilded cage. Silas made tea using the kitchen that probably cost more than his entire apartment building, sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watched New York City pretend to sleep. His phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number. "We know where your grandson is. We know when the surgery is scheduled. Call off the investigation or he doesn't wake up from anesthesia." Silas's blood went cold. He forwarded the message to Tank immediately, fingers shaking. The response came back within seconds. "Security already doubled at hospital. Grandson's room is being moved to secure wing. Don't engage, we handled this." But the message had made its point. The Moretti family wasn't defeated, just cornered. And cornered predators were the most dangerous kind. Silas tried to sleep but couldn't. Spent the hours until dawn pacing the penthouse, checking his phone obsessively, imagining scenarios where tomorrow went wrong in every possible way. At 4 a.m., Tank knocked on the door. "Time to go. Hospital's ready for us." Presbyterian memorial at dawn was different from the nighttime chaos Silas remembered. Cleaner, quieter, the kind of professional calm that preceded major surgeries. Tank led him through service corridors to a private wing Silas hadn't known existed. High security, restricted access, the kind of place where politicians and celebrities recovered from procedures they didn't want public. Elijah was in a corner suite, already in a hospital gown, looking young and scared and trying to hide both. He managed a weak smile when Silas entered. "Hey, Grandpa. Nice escort." Tank took up position outside the door, visible through the window, a statement to anyone watching that this patient was protected. Silas sat beside the bed, took Elijah's hand. "How are you feeling?" "Like I'm about to get cut open and have someone else's bone marrow installed." Elijah's attempt at humor fell flat. The doctor explained everything, said the match is really good, 98% compatibility, said I have excellent chances. "You're going to be fine. You can't know that." Silas squeezed his grandson's hand, feeling how thin it had become, how the leukemia had eaten away muscle and fat until only determination remained. "No, but I can tell you that the surgeon is the best in New York, that this hospital just got acquired by people who have a vested interest in making sure you recover and that you're stronger than this disease." Elijah looked at him, really looked, seeing past the tired grandfather to something harder underneath. "Who did you help, Grandpa? Who's powerful enough to make all this happen?" The honest answer was complicated, dangerous, not something a 17-year-old should know. But Elijah deserved truth, even partial truth. Someone who was dying from poison that the doctors couldn't identify. "I used Grandpa's old medicine, the plant remedies from the mountains, saved his life. He's paying me back by making sure you get yours saved too." Is he a good person? The question was impossibly naive, the kind only someone who hadn't lived in the gray areas could ask. He's a complicated person, but he keeps his word, and right now that's what matters. The surgical team arrived at 5:30. Nurses, anesthesiologists, the surgeon herself. Dr. Catherine Walsh was 50, competent professional, with the kind of confidence that came from successful outcomes rather than arrogance. She explained the procedure again, answered Elijah's questions, projected calm certainty that made the impossible feel routine. When they wheeled Elijah toward the OR, he reached out, grabbed Silas's hand one more time. "If something goes wrong, nothing's going wrong. But if it does, tell Mom I tried. Tell her I made it as far as I could." Silas's throat closed around words that wouldn't come. Elijah's mother, his daughter-in-law, had died 3 years after his son, cancer like Grace. Like the universe had decided his family was easier to kill than protect. Elijah was the last thread connecting him to Daniel, to Grace, to the life he'd built before it all fell apart. "You tell her yourself, when you're 90 and surrounded by great-grandchildren." Elijah smiled, weak but real, and then they took him through the double doors into sterile brightness where Silas couldn't follow. Tank materialized at his elbow. "Recovery is 6 to 8 hours. You should eat, rest. Nothing happens until he's awake." But Silas couldn't leave, couldn't do anything except wait in the family lounge that smelled like anxiety and old coffee. Tank stayed with him, silent sentinel, checking his phone periodically but offering no information about whatever security measures were in place. 3 hours into the wait, a nurse appeared. "Dr. Bramwell, Mr. Volkov is asking for you." Silas followed her to the VIP wing, to the same room where he'd saved Dante's life 2 days ago. Dante was dressed in slacks and a button-down, looking almost normal except for the bandage visible under his rolled sleeve. Another man sat across from him, 60, expensive suit, the kind of lawyer who charged by the millisecond. Dante gestured to a chair. "Silas, this is Harrison Webb, my attorney. We're finalizing your employment contract." The contract was 20 pages of legal language that Silas couldn't focus on, his mind still in the OR where Elijah was being rebuilt cell by cell. Harrison walked him through the highlights: salary that was obscene, benefits that were comprehensive, termination clauses that heavily favored employee rights, non-compete agreements that were surprisingly reasonable. Sign here, here, and here. You're officially the Director of Integrative Medicine, Presbyterian Memorial Hospital, effective today. Silas signed without reading the details, beyond caring about the mechanics of his transformation. Dante watched him with those predator's eyes that saw too much. You're distracted. My grandson is in surgery. I know, which is why I'm handling this now while you're too worried to argue about salary or job requirements. Dante's smile was slight, almost sympathetic. When he wakes up and you know he's going to be fine, you'll have employment locked in, security in place, and no room to second-guess yourself into quitting. The manipulation was so transparent it almost wasn't manipulation. Just pragmatic understanding of human nature. Silas found himself saying, "You're good at this. Reading people, knowing what they need. It's how you build an empire. Understand what people value, give it to them before they know they need it. Make yourself indispensable." Dante leaned back, wincing slightly. "You saved my life because you needed money for Elijah. I'm giving you money, position, protection, everything you need to keep saving lives. Now you're invested in my success because your success depends on it. That's cynical. That's business. The fact that I also genuinely appreciate what you did is just a bonus." Dr. Walsh appeared in the doorway, still in surgical scrubs, mask pulled down around her neck. Silas stood so fast he knocked over his chair. "How is he?" "Surgery went perfectly. The transplant took. Vitals are excellent. No complications." Her smile was professional but warm. "He's in recovery now. Anesthesia should wear off in about an hour. You can see him then." Relief hit like a tidal wave, strong enough that Silas had to sit back down before his knees gave out. Dante nodded to Dr. Walsh. "Thank you, Catherine. Your usual fee plus 20% bonus for the excellent work." When she left, Dante stood, testing his balance. "Come on, I'll walk you to recovery." They moved through corridors that felt different now, transformed by ownership from Presbyterian Memorial into Volkov Medical Enterprise. Staff nodded to Dante with respect that bordered on fear, then looked at Silas with curiosity, trying to place the old man walking with the boss. Recovery was a smaller wing, quieter, designed for the delicate hours after major surgery. Elijah was in the second room, pale against white sheets, IV lines, and monitors tracking every bodily function. But his chest rose and fell steadily, color already better than it had been in months. Silas sat beside the bed, took his grandson's hand, felt the warmth that meant alive, that meant fighting, that meant possible futures instead of countdown clocks. Dante stood in the doorway watching, his expression unreadable. "He looks like you. Same stubborn jaw. He looks like his father. My son, Daniel." "The police officer." Silas glanced up, surprised. "You investigated me." "Of course. I don't trust people just because they save my life. I trust them after I know everything about them." Dante's voice was matter-of-fact. "Daniel Bramwell, killed in the line of duty 8 years ago. Domestic disturbance call, suspect had a gun, your son took 3 rounds protecting the woman who'd called 911. Died before the ambulance arrived." The facts were correct but sanitized, missing the texture of grief, the way Silas had identified the body, the funeral where half the NYPD showed up because Daniel had been that kind of cop, dedicated, heroic, dead at 34. "He was a good man, better than me." "Maybe, but you're the one still here, still fighting, still saving people." Dante's voice softened slightly. "Your son would be proud of what you did. Saving a stranger, saving his son. That's the kind of heroism that doesn't make the news but matters more." Elijah stirred, eyelids fluttering. Silas leaned closer. "Hey, kid. I'm here. You're okay." Elijah's eyes opened, unfocused and confused. "Grandpa?" "Right here. Surgery's done. Dr. Walsh said everything went perfectly. Hurts. The word came out slurred, anesthesia still clouding his thoughts. I know. They'll give you something for the pain. You just rest. Elijah's gaze drifted to Dante standing in the doorway, recognition flickering despite the drugs. I know you. You're on the news sometimes. Dante Volkov. Dante stepped into the room, his expression carefully neutral. That's right. You're the one Grandpa saved. I am, which means I owe him everything. By extension, I owe you too. Dante's voice carried weight beyond simple gratitude. You recover. Beat this disease. Go to Cornell. Live the life your father would have wanted. That's how you pay me back. Elijah tried to nod, but the movement made him wince. Okay, deal. Then he drifted back to sleep, pulled under by exhaustion and medication. Silas stayed by the bed, unwilling to leave, anchored by the steady beep of monitors that said alive, recovering, fighting. Dante's phone buzzed. He checked the screen, expression darkening. I have to go. Moretti's situation needs attention. Tank will stay with you. Don't leave the hospital without him. He was gone before Silas could respond, moving with purpose despite his injuries. Tank appeared moments later, taking up position outside the recovery room. Visible sentinel promising violence to anyone who threatened his charge. The next 36 hours blurred together. Elijah woke periodically, lucid and hurting and scared. Silas stayed beside him through shift changes and meal deliveries and doctors making their rounds. Tank rotated with other security, always at least one guard visible, sometimes two, a constant reminder that normal hospital security wasn't protecting this patient. On the second day, Galina Volkov arrived carrying a care package, Russian pastries, tea that smelled like forests, a small icon that she placed on Elijah's bedside table without explanation. She stayed for an hour, telling stories about her own grandmother's healing traditions, making Elijah laugh despite the pain medication haze. When she left, she kissed Silas's forehead like he was family, like saving her son had bound them together in ways that transcended employment or obligation. The gesture was so unexpected, so genuinely maternal, that Silas felt something crack in his chest. The armor he'd built after Grace died, after Daniel died, after 6 years of being invisible and alone. By day 3, Elijah was sitting up, eating solid food, cracking jokes about his new bone marrow being an upgrade. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, using phrases like excellent progress and ahead of schedule with the careful optimism of people who'd seen recoveries fail at the last minute. Silas finally left the hospital on day 4, driven back to the penthouse by Tank in silence that felt companionable rather than hostile. He showered, slept for 14 hours straight, woke to messages from Dante about department staffing, and from Elijah about feeling strong enough to walk the hallway. His new office at Presbyterian was everything Dante had promised. Corner suite, park view, space for both administrative work and hands-on medicine. His grandfather's medical books lined one shelf, salvaged from his apartment, along with the photograph of Grace and Daniel that now sat on his desk. The first staff meeting was surreal. 3 doctors willing to learn traditional medicine. Dr. James Morrison, young and eager. Dr. Sarah Chen, skeptical but curious. Dr. Robert Okafor, older and wise enough to know modern medicine had limits. 2 research assistants fresh from graduate programs. An administrative coordinator who looked terrified of Silas's lack of credentials, until he started discussing alkaloid extraction methods, and she realized he knew more than most pharmacologists. They spent 6 hours outlining research priorities, clinical trial protocols, partnership opportunities with indigenous healers. Silas felt his grandfather's presence hovering over the discussion, approving of knowledge being preserved, shared, integrated into systems that had tried to erase it. By week 2, Elijah was cleared to go home, not to Silas's old apartment, which Dante had declared compromised, but to a secured facility in Brooklyn that looked like a normal brownstone but had security measures that would shame most embassies. Galina had prepared a room for him, filled it with books and medical equipment and the kind of suffocating care that only Russian grandmothers could provide. Silas visited every evening after work, still adjusting to his new life, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. It came on a Wednesday. He was in his office reviewing research proposals when Tank appeared in the doorway, expression grim. "We have a situation. Mr. Volkov needs you. Now." The drive took 20 minutes, heading to a warehouse in Red Hook that looked abandoned but hummed with the kind of quiet activity that meant serious business. Tank led him inside past guards who looked like they'd seen combat into a back room where Dante waited with 3 other men. On the floor, tied to a chair and bleeding from a dozen small cuts, was Dr. Maxwell Hendricks. Dante's voice was conversational, almost friendly. "Dr. Hendricks has been very cooperative. He's told us everything about the Moretti family's plan, about the payment structure, about the 6 other targets they had lined up after me." Hendricks looked up, saw Silas, and something like hope flickered in his eyes. "Please, tell him I'm sorry. Tell him I made a mistake. I was in debt. I needed the money. I didn't think—" Dante held up a hand, silencing him. "Dr. Hendricks, this isn't about apology. This is about consequences." He turned to Silas, and the weight of that gaze was heavier than anything Silas had felt before. "You saved my life. That gives you a voice in what happens to the man who tried to end it. So I'm asking, what do you think justice looks like here?" The question hung in the air, impossible and terrible. Silas looked at Hendricks, bleeding, terrified, reduced to begging, and saw the man who'd been willing to let him die for being inconvenient, who'd poisoned Dante for money, who'd operated without conscience until consequences caught up. The old Silas, the invisible janitor, would have said, "Let the police handle it. Let the system work. Stay clean and uninvolved." But that Silas had died somewhere in the past 2 weeks, dissolved like black tissue under iridescent paste. The new Silas, Dr. Bramwell, who drank vodka with Russian crime lords and built medical departments on blood money, heard himself say, "He tried to kill you. That's attempted murder. But he failed because I stopped him, so he doesn't get the clean death he was willing to give you." Dante's smile was sharp, satisfied. "What do you suggest? Prison. Real prison. Where the Moretti family's enemies are waiting. Where every day he'll remember that 2 men beat him. One who saved a life he tried to end and one who refused to die on his schedule." Hendricks started crying, ugly, desperate sobs. "Please, no. They'll kill me in there. The Moretti people, the Volkov people, I'll be dead in a month." "Then I suggest you cooperate with the authorities very thoroughly." Silas's voice was steady, colder than he'd known it could be. "Give them everything, names, accounts, plans. Maybe if you're useful enough, someone will keep you breathing." Dante nodded to Tank. "Make sure he gets to the federal building intact. Full cooperation with the FBI, complete testimony, immunity for nothing." As they dragged Hendricks out, still sobbing, still begging, Dante poured 2 glasses of whiskey. "You're learning how to operate in my world, how to balance mercy and justice, how to make choices that matter." Silas took the glass, drank, felt the burn settle into his chest alongside all the other transformations of the past 2 weeks. "I'm not sure I like who I'm becoming." "Nobody does at first, but you'll get used to it. The person who saves lives and the person who decides consequences, they're not as different as you think." Outside, sirens wailed in the distance. Somewhere in the city, Elijah was recovering, gaining strength, building toward Cornell and futures that had seemed impossible 3 weeks ago. Somewhere else, the Moretti family was collapsing under federal investigation. Their assassination plot turned into their destruction. And in a warehouse in Red Hook, Silas Bramwell stood beside a crime lord who'd remade his life, drinking whiskey that cost more than his old monthly salary, becoming someone his grandfather would have recognized, A healer who understood that sometimes saving lives meant making terrible choices about whose lives were worth saving. The old ways worked because they were true. Plants remembered laws older than chemistry, and men like Silas remembered that survival wasn't about staying invisible. It was about being seen when it mattered, acting when others froze, and living with the consequences of choosing to heal in a world that rewarded violence. He finished his whiskey and followed Dante out into the New York night, no longer a janitor, no longer invisible, just a man who'd saved a life and discovered that salvation came with its own kind of damnation.